Hello and welcome to our event on the gender news gap. I'm Claire Mason, founder and CEO of global thought leadership consultancy Man Bites Dog, and we're delighted to be teaming up with the Women in Journalism team on this important campaign. I'd also like to thank our partners Cision, Coleman Parks and Big Helping, who have supported us on a pro bono basis. The Gender News Gap research study has been 6 months in the making. We have interviewed 1,200 male and female journalists to investigate the state of gender diversity in UK journalism and its impact on female journalists, the media, and society more broadly. I'm going to share an overview of our research findings to kick us off, and then introduce our fantastic expert panel to share their insights. So please pop any extra questions for the panel into the chat. Okay, so what is the gender news gap? To put it simply, it's the lack of gender diversity in UK journalism. When we embarked together with Women in Journalism on this study, we wanted to see how far we had progressed towards gender equality. But what we found, I would say to our horror, was that the gender gap in journalism stubbornly persists, and that we remain a very long way from the representative gender balance we want to see in UK media. Our research reveals that fewer than 1 in 5 female journalists believe that there is adequate gender diversity in UK journalism, and less than a quarter of all UK journalists rate gender diversity in the media as good or excellent. Our research identifies some of the greatest challenges facing women in journalism right now. Access to the profession is a critical challenge. Nearly half of UK journalists believe that access is more difficult for women than men, and nearly 3/4 believe it's harder still for women from ethnic minorities. But the greatest challenge for women in journalism is career progression. A shocking 3/4 of UK journalists, male and female, believe that career progression in journalism is more difficult for women than men. There is an unholy cocktail of causes behind the stalling of women's careers, the greatest of which is leadership and culture. Tone from the top is key. 70% of female journalists complain that the most senior roles remain dominated by men. 3/4 of male and female journalists alike also call out a macho and intimidating culture that isn't serving the profession, and this is particularly prevalent in national newspapers. This is creating what we call a glass newsroom that excludes women from high-status journalism specialisms like hard news, business, finance, and politics. But while the gender news gap is pervasive for many women in journalism, more than half of the female journalists we surveyed reported experiencing pay and career discrimination. But in most instances, like a pane of glass, this inequality is just not seen by their male colleagues, which makes raising awareness a key priority. But why does this gender news gap matter? Well, equality in journalism is a critical foundation for a more equal society. The overwhelming majority of UK journalists believe that diversity in journalism is important. UK journalists believe that the media has a duty to reflect the diversity of the society it serves. Journalists believe the media needs a diversity of journalists to be relevant and interesting to its readers, so it's good business. And journalists, male and female, believe that a balance between male and female journalists is essential to properly represent key societal issues. And for me, it's this issue of representation that's really critical. The gender news gap directly impacts how women and diverse communities are represented, how our experiences and concerns are reflected, and how we make our voices heard to create change. For some years now, my team at Man Bites Dog has been campaigning to close the gender say gap. This is a term I coined to highlight the invisibility of women and other diverse groups as expert authorities in business and in public life. The gender news gap is itself a key contributor to this gender say gap, because the lack of women in journalism is driving a lack of female and diverse expert contributors consulted by the media. So I'm delighted that Professor Liz Howell, founder of the Expert Women Project, is on our panel today. According to our research, more than 4 in 5 women in journalism believe that female journalists and female expert contributors highlight issues that would otherwise be underrepresented. Public opinion and policy are shaped by the people who decide which stories are told and who tells them. If we don't hear from women as journalists and as expert authorities, we're only hearing half the story. And this lack of, say, equality is creating these huge gaps in information, representation and policy, which means that really important issues can go unspoken and ignored for decades. Recent movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter and Reclaim These Streets have spotlighted issues including harassment, discrimination, violence and safety that have been underrepresented in mainstream media. Increasing the diversity of journalists and editors and changing culture is critical to surfacing these issues, generating understanding and empathy, and influencing policy and social change. But while diversity and inclusion is really high on the news agenda every day, sadly our research shows that it's not yet high on the newsroom agenda inside these media organisations. We're just not seeing action for change. And this almost merits a whole new study in itself, but our indicative figures show that less than a quarter of media directors participating in our study measure the gender or ethnic diversity of their journalist workforce, and less than a third of journalists are working in organisations that have set targets to improve the representation of female and diverse expert contributors. So, in summary, we would like to call on media organisations, women and men in journalism to recognise the gender news gap and take action to make journalism the inclusive profession our society deserves. And with that, I'm delighted to end this slideshow and introduce our fantastic panel to debate this issue, and I hope to offer some solutions to close the gender news gap. First up, please welcome Polly Curtis. Polly has been digital editor at The Guardian, editor-in-chief at HuffPost UK, and an editor and partner at Tortoise Media. And her first book, Behind Closed Doors, will be published in February.
Thank you so much for having me. And can I just say thank you for doing this research and for really highlighting these issues, because we need these facts to expose what's happening. Thanks so much for your support, Polly. Really appreciate it.
And next up, we have Tara Welsh, who is senior BBC TV reporter, filmmaker, and winner of an impressive range of awards. And I'm sure that you've all seen her work. Following Tara, we also have Professor Liz Howell, who I mentioned earlier, Emeritus Professor of Journalism at City University and founder of the all-important Expert Women Project. And finally, Dominic Ponsford. Thank you, Dominic, for your support for this campaign as well. Editor-in-Chief of Press Gazette and editor of Media Vertical at the New Statesman Media Group. So it's very interesting for a communicator like me to be in the position of interviewing all of you expert journalists. So I'm going to just dive in. So I'd love to start with Polly. As a successful newsroom leader, do you see a gender news gap in the media industry?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what you've revealed in this research is the pattern that I see in lots of different newsrooms, in the full range of newsrooms. I think kind of I've been a journalist for 20 years, and over that period, it has changed dramatically. There has been, you know, if you'd shown me the newsrooms now that I started out in 20 years ago, I think it would be quite emotional. The Guardian, where I started now, has a majority female news desk and doing national news. Things like that, just so different from where I came from, where I started out. But the fact is, we still are having this conversation because we still urgently need to have this conversation. And because we're not at equal numbers yet, we're nowhere near equal. And that's where we will know that we will have really moved the dial, I suppose. There's other kind of big chinks of hope. I spent time in journalism schools. I was a external examiner at Cardiff, and those courses are now majority women. I think kind of in terms of growing journalists coming through the industry, we are in a change process. But while that glass ceiling has kind of cracked, I think the thing that really needs to change now is the culture. So while there are more and more women in newsrooms, when I started in newsrooms, I did it by fitting into the dominant culture that already existed. And as more and more women are in newsrooms, I think we can start to kind of really assert and change how those newsrooms operate. And I think they'll be much better places and do much better journalism for it.
And I think that's something we're seeing across a range of industries where we have quite a broad female intake, but it's just how do we get them to not get stuck halfway up and actually make it to the top and have an influence on that culture. And that was one of the things that came through that quite shocked me, actually, that a lot of journalists, male and female journalists, felt there was still a macho culture that really wasn't serving anybody. Do you think that if women feel that there is this bad culture and there is this glass newsroom excluding them from the high status professions or the senior roles, is that feeling justified? Do you think those challenges are still there?
I think it's very varied across the industry. Some places have massively and radically changed. Others are in the process of changing. I think we now have a very strong, as a society, we no longer accept the maternity discrimination, the harassment, the pure sexist language that I heard and experienced when I started in newsrooms. You know, we know that's not okay. I think, and I think that is definitely changing. Better HR policies, those kind of things. But the kind of macho culture, the kind of dominant cultures are kind of, it's more subtle than those things as well. It's the news we choose, it's the priorities we make, it's the way we have the conversations, it's management styles, it's everything that makes a culture of a newsroom. And I think I had a fascinating experience going from The Guardian, where I was a news editor in my 30s, to a newsroom that was majority men at the time, majority older than me, and I went from that to running HuffPost in the UK, which was a newsroom of women in their 20s, and I felt like I'd arrived in the future. The culture was so different. The demand to be managed and to be nurtured and to be brought through their careers was just fantastic. I was so bowled over to kind of experience this difference. And you know, I think about the culture in those young female journalists when I think about the future of news.
Fantastic. Thank you, Polly. And Dominic, with your kind of bird's eye view of the whole of the media sector, do you think the industry has a problem here? Is it acting on this problem? Is there a problem, and is it acting on it?
Yeah, well, sadly, I wasn't surprised at all by the results of the survey, because it totally bears out everything, all the research I've seen about this issue over the last few years, in that there's more or less parity, I think, gender parity going into the industry, but there's a big problem when you get to seniority. I think at the moment we've got about a third of our national newspaper editors are female, which is as good as it's ever been in terms of balance, but there's nowhere near parity, is it? And it's kind of weird that we're sort of seeing that as a good thing in a way, that it's up to a third. So it's definitely a big issue for the industry, no doubt about it. I mean, there's two recent examples that we've written about, which sort of give you a bit of hope and a bit of despair, really. So Catherine Salmond, who's the New Scotland Sunday editor this year, came in, and she said that post-COVID, you know, more flexible working meant that she could do this job and sort of balance kind of family life in a way that she wouldn't have dreamt of before the pandemic. But then on the other hand, you had Terry White, who stepped down as editor of Empire. You know, people who know her will know she's a fantastic editor, probably one of the best in the business. And she stepped down because she said she was doing 19-hour days, and she'd you know, recently had a child. So, you know, she just couldn't balance it, and the company wasn't seemingly kind of, you know, willing to help her on that. So it's sort of, you know, hope and despair there, isn't it? I mean, from where I'm sitting, I feel very much that the industry is in a good place at the moment. It's growing at the moment, and I think the the pandemic and remote working has completely turned everyone's ideas on their head about the idea of presenteeism, of, you know, flexibility. It's quite hard to get talent at the moment. So, I mean, from where I'm sitting, and I know other editors too, just overjoyed to get, you know, talent in wherever people are, and be more flexible about it. So I think there's a lot of hope there, but there's definitely a big problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, as you say, it's like COVID sort of, in some ways, it created more flexible working patterns, and so it offers hope for the future. But actually our research found that COVID actually had such a negative impact. So I think as media, you've all been reporting on the sort of devastating impact of COVID on gender equality across a range of industries. And I think journalism was no exception to that, unfortunately. And we saw female journalists more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be made redundant, and also, you know, more likely to have mental health issues as a result of trying to juggle work and family commitments. So hope and despair, as you say, in equal measure. Dominic, all day long, you know, the media's reporting on diversity and inclusion related issues. It is really high on the news agenda. But we're not really seeing a great degree of action. There are some shining lights with programmes like the BBC's 50-50 programme and so forth. But why isn't diversity and inclusion higher on the newsroom agenda, higher on the sort of workplace and organisational agenda of these media businesses? And why is there a lack of action, do you think?
Yeah, I think I just think that the news industry is a sort of last bastion, isn't it, of some very old-fashioned working practices. It's almost a bit medieval, isn't it, really, in the sense that, you know, a newspaper is a kind of has this sort of divine monarch at the top of it who runs it however they like, and you get into some quite sort of unhealthy working practices, don't you, which aren't compatible with a sort of balanced life for a lot of people. So I think that's the issue, isn't it? But yeah, my hope is that it is starting to change. I'm certainly more hopeful about that. Certainly sort of changed the way I worked over the last couple of years, and sort of suddenly introduced myself to my children, which has been really nice. And there's a sort of realization that men and women can be sort of, you know, good journalists as well as sort of good parents and sort of good general human beings, and that's a good thing for your employer as well, isn't it? So that's sort of where I'm hopeful. But yeah, I do think it's not as high on the agenda as it should be, and certainly you see a lot of schemes around other types of diversity, but I can't think of many schemes in the industry around gender diversity, and I'm not sure why that is.
Thanks, Dominic. That's really interesting to get that kind of bigger perspective. And Tara, I'd love to come to you. I was so interested in the way, in your strong interest in stories affecting communities that other journalists sometimes struggle to reach or engage with. Do you think diversity in journalism matters when it comes to choosing whose stories are told and who tells them?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't set out to target communities other people don't reach. I happen to be mixed race. I happen to have been raised in a council flat and on benefits. So I just tell the stories of people that I come into contact with, the people that I kind of come across in my life. So I think, obviously, like, you know, there's a massive issue with gender, but I think it's the diversity issue goes across race and class, and I think it's not just the media. You know, I was in bank today, and you kind of walk around, you think, well, actually the financial sector's not very diverse either. But I do think at the top of media organisations, it is overwhelmingly white and posh. And I do think that reflects storytelling massively. I think that's not the intention, but that's what happens. So yeah, I think, and where there has been a push in recent years for kind of diverse stories, there's not been the same action on finding those storytellers. And so that comes across, and that's not authentic, because you've got an agenda set by people who actually don't have those lived experiences. And like I said, I don't think there's any malice, or I don't think it's intentional, but it definitely comes across. And I think just at the beginning of COVID, you know, you saw, you know, people were trying to stay upbeat, I get it, but you had lots of people doing dances in their massive houses with their kitchen islands and their bifolding doors, and it was the perspective of a certain group of women, you know, potentially people that news editors have got in their WhatsApp groups, but actually, as I understood it, there lots of women weren't able to work from home and were in absolute dire straits at the beginning. And I think that kind of got picked up as it went on, but at the beginning, for me, that was very obvious. Wow, look who journalists have in their contact list, you know. So I do think that was one of the moments where I really kind of visually saw how our storytellers needed to be much more diverse.
It was really interesting as well, I think, in the pandemic, when we've got a healthcare crisis where women and people from a Black and minority ethnic background are overrepresented in healthcare professions and so on, but you always had the doctor was often white male, the frontline worker was often female or from a Black and minority ethnic background, or both, and there was always this, speak to this person about the strategy, speak to this person about the front line, and it just felt like it was reinforcing a lot of those kind of stereotypes as well. And how do you think sort of diversity in journalism impacts investigative journalism? Does that mean that a lack of diversity amongst the journalists is affecting what stories are told and what gets exposed and what we talk about, and leaving a lot of stories untold and only hearing half the story?
Yeah, I mean, massively. You know, I think we're missing lots of important stories across the board. I think the media is missing. I think, for example, you know, the fact that Black women are more than 4 times likely to die in childbirth. I know there's people who've reported on it, but I feel like if that were happening to white women, it would be much more of a scandal. And so I think I do still think we are following issues of women and men that look like our news editors. And like I say, I'm not saying these issues aren't being picked up, but not necessarily on an investigative level that they should be. And so, yeah, I think, you know, like last year, for example, I did an investigation on excessive force used by the police. And I know that lots of other media organisations covered it, but we did a half-an-hour documentary. It's won lots of awards. It was shortlisted for one of Dom's awards, didn't win. But
we'll have words later.
But, you know, I pushed for that story because my lived experience is knowing lots of people that are affected by that. And so I think, yeah, like I think if you haven't got the journalists that just happen to go into the cafe and chat to people that things are affecting, then you're not, you know, if you don't have those contacts, Twitter's great, but we know that it doesn't make up for having a chat with someone in a shop. And so if your network, you know, aren't these people, then how are you ever going to bring those ideas to the table in the newsroom?
I love what you're saying about the story and the storytellers as well, and actually sort of bringing those voices direct is fantastic. Our research also showed, I think recent NCTJ research showed that the percentage of non-white journalists is still not representative of our society, and our research suggested that access and career progression was just even more challenging for women from a non-white background. Do you think there's a diversity problem, and do you think it's getting better, and is it moving fast enough?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Love to know your view.
So I've been in the industry for about 13 years, and I think things are changing. I almost turned around and ran the other way, because I started off my work experience at national newspapers and was like, wow, this is not for me. But then I was really lucky to get on a training scheme at the BBC. And like I say, I think things have changed, and I think those entry level schemes are good. But I think one of the biggest barriers, particularly to working class women, is still the cost. You know, you haven't got as many local newspapers, so people aren't going through that route. And there's this kind of expectation that you're going to go to university, you're going to go down the city route, which, no offence, but is expensive. So I think there's massive barriers to getting working class women into journalism. But really the change needs to come from, you know, I think promoting women who are already in the industry, because then change will come when they reach those more senior roles.
I think that is a compounding factor. I think we'd seen that for women, they were more likely to have age discrimination based on social class as well. So yeah, that's fascinating. So we need to get more women in, but also it's trying to stop people getting stuck in the middle, isn't it? Which is a key problem here. Thank you very much, Tara. That's great. So Liz, a big question for you as my heroine on your Expert Women project. Why does gender balance in journalism matter? Why should we care?
Wherever there's disproportionate representation of men versus women, it's bad. It's bad because women are 51% of the population, so they're a very big element of the population and they need to be heard. It's bad because they have something to offer, and it's bad because it's just unfair. And we should always be fighting unfairness. So I don't think it's a question that takes a great deal of analysis to answer. It's just the right thing to do is to properly represent women in news media. And so when we started the Expert Women Project, we were just really a cross-load of people, some students and myself. We were listening to the Today programme, and there were 6 times as many men, authoritative men, talking as women. And we particularly looked at broadcasting and at authority figures, because whilst you've got something like the 50-50 initiative at the BBC, which is brilliant to have 50-50 men and women, a magician and his beautiful assistant is 50-50, but it's not really proportional representation of the influence of women in society. So we were looking at these authority figures, and you can effect change, because whilst I'm sure there would have been some incipient change anyway, I'm absolutely convinced, and I have the evidence of editors who've said so, that the Expert Women campaign to get more authority figures on broadcast news made a very big difference. And it's still not great. It is by no means great, but it's much, much better than it was. So having the figures like in the survey that you've done is wonderful, but we have to then put the pressure on the people in power to react to those figures. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because if they don't care, then nothing will happen. So the question for me is, how do you make them care? How do you make those people react? Because their temptation is to say, oh yeah, another moan from loads of women. I mean, when I started this, one of the people I work with said, oh God, are you banging on about that again? And there is that feeling, you know, that you've had the vote since 1928, what's your problem? And there's a much bigger problem out there than that. And it's getting people to notice it. And I notice in the group of people who are on the webinar, there's Karen Ross, Professor Karen Ross, who's been involved in the Global Media Monitoring Project for several years. That is a fantastic international project that looks at women in the newspapers, in broadcast news, and it's about the people who appear rather than journalists themselves, and it's very, very indicative. And it's a question of us all getting together and corporately, if you like, putting the pressure on the people in power. I mean, that's what journalism is supposed to be about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And we have to do it on this one. And just at the risk of banging on again, I would say we do have to watch the fashions in these things, because sometimes it's all the news, everyone's talking about how terrible it is for women and they all want to cover your story. Then another year they couldn't care less because something else has come up. And you've got to consistently keep the pressure on. And that's the difficulty.
And I was really interested in the latest study that you did, which showed, you know, that where this level of representation is going, and particularly the impact of COVID-19 and the government on representation of female authority figures. Can you just expand on that a bit for us?
Yes, it's been really indicative. So we saw this trajectory since 2014-15. We had some really great people like Tessa Jowell and so on who supported this campaign. We got quite a lot of publicity. Editors on the 6 news programs that we monitored all said, oh, this is terrible, we'll get more women. And you saw it actually working. And it went up and up and up. So it started at 6, or I think the first formal survey we did was 5 to 1, just under 5 to 1 men to women. And so it did improve. And then suddenly, for the first time, the trajectory stalled in COVID in 2020. And we only monitored 3 months that year, but you saw a really big difference. So for example, in the first months we did, February, there were, the ratio of men to women was really good. In March, it was really bad. And that's because government dominated, politicians dominated. We have a very male dominated government. Then in April, it was better again, but the women who were represented were from care homes and hospitals, exactly like Tara was saying. And so you got quite a lot of women, but they weren't the top experts. They were the middle and the lower experts. So COVID has been bad. It's been bad for equality of women on broadcast news.
And do you think government has a responsibility when it's appointing cabinet ministers and when it's thinking about who it chooses to speak at cabinet briefings that are driving the news agenda, like the COVID briefings, to do something about this?
Absolutely, of course they do. And it's very interesting that when you get this sort of national crisis, at least at first, it was like men to the fore, because we're used to men as the leaders in, this awful sort of Churchill comparison you keep getting and so on. We're looking to men to lead us. Of course, it's ridiculous because we have some fantastic women leaders, but we're still at that transitional point where the journalists haven't got quite used to the idea that the women can be there as authority figures and leaders as well. And sadly, a lot of the people who were authority figures at that point were men. So yes, the government does have some responsibility for this.
Yeah, we spoke to journalists who were frustrated that they actually had personal diversity targets they'd set themselves to try and improve, and they couldn't hit them because of the government news cycle, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
So.
This is a double-edged sword, though, because you often get journalists, particularly male journalists, who will say, well, I want to put the best person on my program, and I'm afraid the best person wasn't a woman. And you have to say, well, you can put women on it in other regards. They could be critiquing those people, or you can put pressure on people to have more women in authoritative roles. It's a difficult one because, of course, journalists want to put the best guy on the screen. But there are lots and lots of people out there, women, who've got a lot to say. They just have to be asked.
Absolutely. And also there have been a lot of, for example, fantastic female scientists that don't always want to have a public profile. So that we could perhaps bring more to the fore, because I think as women we have to volunteer, don't we, and step forward. Otherwise there's nobody for the journalist to interview.
Well, we did quite a lot of detailed work on this with the expert women themselves. Why would you go on screen? Why would you not go on screen? Interestingly, the things that you'd think might affect them, like appearance, were much more minor than things like not being thought up myself, not being thought to be, too big for my boots, not having my male colleagues not like me. That was the sort of thing that came across. So it is difficult, and you do have to overcome that, but it's sort of the responsibility of the broadcasters to encourage those women to come forward.
Yeah, and the organisations that are putting forward spokespeople. So it's an opportunity for the communications industry and the journalist profession to work together to make sure we're getting the right spokespeople for the right opportunities, and really thinking about that diversity of perspectives that Tara was talking about.
But they won't do it unless there's an appetite from the audience, and we are the audience.
Yeah.
So if every time you see a News at 10 or a program where you think, there's so many men on this, ring up and complain, and that's the way you'll get change.
Absolutely, we need to take this into our own hands, don't we, and start calling it out. I do always have a go at the BBC every time I hear the word businessman, so that's my latest thorn in my side.
I mean, I'm not saying it's women's responsibility. I'm absolutely not saying that. But what I am saying is that if we make our feelings very clearly felt, then that will help with change.
Absolutely. So returning to you, Polly, thinking about change, and actually coming back to some of what Dominic was saying earlier about the sort of hopes and hopes and troubles around this. One of the things that our research suggests is that inflexible working practices in the media, like those on social hours Dominic mentioned, are also a career limiting factor for working parents and carers, forcing many women into freelance roles. So as someone who's worked in both a very fast-moving news environment and slow news in tortoise media, I wanted to ask whether you think working patterns in the journalism profession make it harder for women, and whether COVID-19 has potentially compounded these challenges.
Fascinating question. There was just one thing I wanted to kind of pick up that I just heard so
Sure.
starkly in all my colleagues' comments before about intersectionality, really. And I think about the fact that, Dominic said that there are lots of diversity schemes for people of colour at the moment, less focus on women. I heard Liz talking about the kind of fashion for these things changing, and I just thought that was a really interesting theme. And then listening to Tara's really saying, talking about the intersections between class and race and gender, and true diversity, which is complex and has many facets to it. And I just thought that was an interesting theme to pick up from what everyone was saying, because it made me think a lot about when I'm hiring teams, diversity has been at the forefront of my mind, because actually it's been a business need for I've ever worked. It's been business critical to become more diverse, and just that conversation made me think about it in a different way. So I thought I'd just identify that. On the question of kind of COVID and whether it's affected flexible working and all of those things, I personally always feel a bit embarrassed talking about flexible working, because I've got a stay-at-home husband who has, as my career has got bigger and bigger, he's been at home more and more, and so I've been flexible working hasn't actually been that much of an issue for me. That's how it works in my house. But I think the really big change that happened in newsrooms in the course of my career was digital, because before that we were all driven by one deadline every day that was right at the end of the day and late, and that is what really put women off, was 8 p.m 10 p.m deadlines. But now actually we're on 24-hour news cycles. You have to work shifts. That's been incredibly liberating at very difficult times in my career where I did find it really hard to manage work-life balance. Actually, it's the digital jobs that let me work more in the ways I wanted to work. So I think that has been the big change over the course of my career. And I think your research shows that COVID has affected men and women very differently. But I think overall the risk of COVID and hybrid working is that you get a two-track workforce. The people are in the office and part of the real power and part of the real conversation, and then people at home who are just going to lose the purchase on the conversation. If that's more women, if that's more younger people, if there are defining characteristics, then that's not going to be fair or the right thing for the news.
And thinking about tone at the top, which is almost where we started, and leadership, what role do you think leadership can play in helping crack the progression of women and all of our diverse communities in the newsroom? Because it seems like this starts before people even become a journalist, and access is enough of a problem, but progression is almost twice as bad as access. So why are women getting stuck in the middle, and what do you think that leaders might be able to do to unpick this?
I mean, I think at the entry level, diversity in many ways is hampered, particularly on social class, but not necessarily on gender. And then you see at the other end, like Dominic said, a third of Fleet Street editors are now women. That's transformative. It's not equal yet, but it is transformative. And, every time a headhunter calls me, they'll say at some point in the conversation, oh, we really want a woman for this role. And I just think, oh God, that there is a real, people want to hire women in really senior leadership roles because they think that will change anything. I think the real problem is where the power sits in a lot of newsrooms is in the operational leadership day to day, that's making day-to-day decisions. about what the news is and what we're going to be covering on that day, and that is still probably the least diverse in most newsrooms I know very well. That kind of operational, in charge of the news day, making the live decisions. And I think that's where you can make the biggest difference. I think, you know, women hire women, like diverse leadership, putting the power into more a more diverse group of people will inevitably have a kind of multiplying effect. You know, I've never found it hard to hire women. I just, you know, there are so many brilliant women. I look at organizations that are really male dominated, and I just think, what's the mindset that made it so hard to hire brilliant women?
I completely agree with you. As someone with a very female workforce, it's never hard to find brilliant talent, is it? So
I have to say, it's also there has been moments where that's been to a fault, and I've hired too much. Actually, the first really big hiring role I definitely hired too much in my own image, which was about hiring women, and I got, you know, I'm just going to sound really arrogant, I got a brilliant team, but it had quite a narrow viewpoint. It was quite the same view, the same approach. And since that experience, I've always thought about diversity in teams and how they work together, and the different ideas that you'll get from different people, and the complementary kind of whole that you're kind of striving for.
It's so important to have those differences, isn't it? Absolutely. And it kind of bridges back to what Tara was saying earlier. And I was quite interested in what you said, Tara, about the news we choose, which almost makes me think about what Polly was saying around, you know, who are the people that decide what the news is and the stories you want to tell. Tara, you've posted about reporting gaps. What role do you think more diverse journalists and spokespeople can play in surfacing those kind of underrepresented issues, and also potentially choosing different news for us to hear about? How do we close those reporting gaps?
Oh, I think it goes back to everything we've spoken about. But it was interesting hearing Polly speak about the kind of mentality of who we hire. And I think actually, ultimately, what we need to do is turn it on its head, how we think about recruiting diverse talent, because I feel like leaders almost think they're doing people a favour by having schemes, or, you know, oh, we need to get more women, like it's doing the women a favour, like it doesn't enrich the storytelling. Like, having diverse people on, you know, on your programme, on your newspaper, that can only be a good thing and good for business. So I don't understand why this mentality doesn't shift to say, okay, this is actually a really good thing for business, rather than, you know, for the people that are applying for these roles. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah,
That wasn't really answering your question.
The product and the relevance. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah. And actually, probably that bridges maybe back to Dominic, in terms of, Dominic, how does diversity in media impact that audience relevance? Is it good business, as Tara says, to do so? What should modern media look like now?
That is quite a tough question to answer, actually, because there's not a lot of data around. But I had a look at the 2017 National Readership Survey, which is the latest data I could find, and the newspaper readership skew male across the board, apart from two exceptions, and I'll definitely a good quiz question that. So the Guardian, probably doesn't surprise you, then the Daily Mail is the only national newspaper with actually more female than male readership, possibly because it's a female section. It's covered. It's put quite a lot of resources into that. Yeah, and I think there was a survey around the same time that found 3/4 of bylines were male. So you can see there that newspaper industry that's struggling to keep readers is probably not doing itself any favors if it's neglecting half of them. Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of go slightly off off piste a bit, or just to ask a question really that I'm interested in, is I saw like the Guardian and the Telegraph are two companies that got sort of equal parental leave now, and I know sort of anecdotally that's sort of led to, I can think of situations that led to sort of high-powered kind of people, you know, media couples sort of sharing the leave and then both going back to their jobs in a way that you might not have seen before. And I just wondered whether people think is that a possible solution, or is it a bit of a red herring to think about, to focus purely on the sort of childcare side of it? Don't know.
I'd be interested to know what you guys think. I think that the data that we have just shows very much that anyone with children is almost forced into a freelance career without flexibility. But I don't know, Tara, Polly, do you have a view on that question?
Tara, do you have a view? Otherwise,
I have to admit, I'm working in a workspace that I've paid for because my house is chaos at this time of the evening. So I've got two small children.
My children are locked in the basement.
So I think, yeah, I mean, how can it not be massive? But obviously not all women have children or want to have children, and still face some of the same barriers. But yeah, I think personally, I work for an employer who's actually really supportive. I had 13 months off with my second child, maternity. So I'm quite lucky, but I know there's other women that have massive problems and have left the industry because of working practices. So while my experience is pretty good, I know that it's dire for other women. So yeah, I do think it will make a difference.
I think I echo that. I actually think there's times where I felt sorry for men prior to the legal changes. When I had my daughter, there wasn't equal parental leave rights, and I remember thinking, like, God, how awful if you didn't have a maternity leave and a kind of some headspace from your career at some point, just working and working and working. And I think that for people who don't have children as well, I think having 6 months away from the office, doing a much harder job, but away from the office actually gave me a lot of headspace. And I think I went back after both kids, kind of, I don't know, it gave me a perspective that made me better able to manage my career in a way, because it wasn't everything. But if workplaces are losing women because they haven't got the right policies to support them through parenting, then they're just failing.
I mean, in the war for talent, you're not going to win, are you?
And now when the talent war is it's really hard to hire at the moment. It's really, really hard. And these are the questions you get asked. How are you going to support me not only through my career with you, but through my life with you? So, it's just an own goal, isn't it?
It certainly is. And there's a question in actually from Lucy Saunders in the chat here. Do low rates of pay make it difficult for anyone without parental support to get a start in journalism? So that, I guess that's coming back to actually, I'm sure low rates of pay don't help the childcare payment situation either, but it's also coming back to that sort of, you were talking about the lack of access not necessarily being a challenge for women, but potentially being a challenge based on income.
Tara, what do you think about that?
I mean, like I say, it's not my own personal experience, although actually it has crippled us almost, having kids. Our childcare is more than our mortgage. And what I also find in journalism, it's really antisocial hours. So we're kind of paying for like wraparound childcare, like really kind of, it feels almost impossible some days, but financially I feel okay. But I certainly know, and I see women every day who are prolonging having children because they say, oh, I'm going to wait for that promotion, I'm going to wait for that pay rise. And so I do think it's prohibitive in some cases, for sure.
I think the question about whether pay is putting people going into journalism, I just don't know how that compares with other industries. But I would say kind of one of the biggest challenges I think at the moment we have in recruiting more diverse talent into the industry is the reputation that the industry has amongst young people and the lack of trust in the media that the next generation of young people have. And I think that's going to be the biggest barrier for diversifying the workforce and new people coming into the industry. I was at a school the other day doing a talk, and just the kind of, no one's tried to win their trust in news, and no one is talking about the things they really, really care about. And I really felt, that trust barrier is going to be the biggest thing to overcome.
And there's another question just here in from the chat as well, from Samir, with a really good point around capital as well, not only affecting people going into the industry, but to your point earlier, Polly, about a very different tone at HuffPost. Women and minorities have much less access to capital to start their own businesses in general and to start their own independent news channels. So that's actually, a key barrier for women in the news as well. So what message would you give to funders and investors in the UK about more diverse media organisations? Very interesting question.
I would say if they're investing in any kind of media at all, where they need to start with is the audience. Is there an audience? Is it there to be one? And I think that will naturally flow into a question around diversity, because it's diverse audiences that are not being catered for by an industry that's been so legacy male white dominated. So it would make investment sense to start with the audiences where there's most opportunity, I suppose.
Could I
sound really mercenary?
Could I come in on this? Because when we were doing our research about expert women, there was a sort of leap in 2015 of more women on screen. And I actually asked a research colleague of mine to find out what the audience figures were, whether those programs with more women experts on were suffering as a result of having more women experts. And in fact, although you can't say it's cause and effect, but what you can say is that they were not suffering because they actually had increased figures. So there was no evidence that having more women on the screen led to lower ratings of audience ratings. So women on screen were actually quite successful for those programs. So there is evidence that having more women on screen or involved in the presentation or in the business generally is better for the business. The other point I'd like to make is about parental leave. There is some evidence that men are actually not taking parental leave. They don't actually want to be at home with small children. It's much easier going into the office. And I think that this is something we've got to take into account. I've just got a 5-month-old grandson. My daughter is at home. And when she was born, I had to go back to work. She is now in a situation where her job is guaranteed. She can go back. She's got set maternity leave. It wasn't quite like that for me. I mean, just a crude anecdote. I was the only lactating in Vision reporter in the north of England in 1974. So things have improved. They're not great. But again, it's a question of making these things evident to our editors and the bosses that you need women and you need mothers. Not all women are mothers, and why should they be? But when you have got children, you can make the point that you have a right to be there and to be heard. And it's terribly important. So we need that element. That's, in a sense, I know it's absolutely ridiculous, but in a sense, mothers are another form of diversity, and we need to make that point.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to ask you one quick question before I move on to a final tip from all of you. But as you are all here as expert women in your own right, alongside Dominic, Liz, You talk a lot about spokespeople having a public profile and what holds them back, and our research has actually shown that women as experts in their own right, you know, female journalists, when you look at the female journalists that get interviewed, they don't get interviewed as experts and pundits as often as the male journalists at all, do they?
No, and there's this classic thing of, no, we've got Professor Fred Brown here, and over to you, Liz, you know, and the way they look at you is different. And we've really just got to keep on making the point all the time. And even if that makes you feel that you're being disliked, or they're going to think you're unpleasant, or they're going to think you're pushy, almost the greatest sin known to man, then you've still got to bite the bullet on that and do it. It isn't easy, but making the point every time helps. So if you're going on a program, you say, my title is Professor. And at the time you're doing it, you're thinking, nah, but you've got to do it. There's still that discrimination and that feeling, you know, that women shouldn't really make a big thing about how important they are.
I think that's absolutely true, and we've shown that women as well tend to suffer more trolling, which is also off-putting. So on our final few minutes, I'd love to just get a thought from each of you on what we can do to close the gender news gap. And if we could come to Dominic last, because he'd like to say a little word about our charity for this campaign. So Liz, would you like to kick us off while you're here on screen?
Yeah, I just love the point made by Sue Lawton about dead men. I mean, about obituary. The obituary columns are full of men, and I suppose it will get better as we die. You can only know, but it really is, again, a point to make to editors that, you know, lots and lots of interesting women die as well. I would like to make one point, and that is that you can make a difference. I don't want anyone to go away from this webinar, and I'm sure you don't, Claire, feeling terribly depressed, because you can make a difference. You can make a difference by complaining. You can make a difference by getting involved in various campaigns. The Expert Women campaign did make a difference. So yeah, don't feel negative, just keep fighting.
Thank you so much. That's a brilliant point. Keep fighting. And Tara, what would your tip be?
Goodness me, I was just trying to think of one.
Or we could go to Polly while
Yes, go to Polly.
As she shamelessly plugs her new book.
No, I'm really embarrassed you went to me as I was shamelessly plugging my book in your chat. I would say, I think there's a time thing around gender diversity that women will come in. It is getting better, and I think, you know, what this conversation has made me really think about is what do we want to do with that? And that kind of comes to the point around inclusion. I think kind of diversity is one thing, but how do we want to change? If 74% of people still think newsrooms are really, really macho, how do we want to change it? How do we want to make more empathetic, nicer places to work that get better stories than the newsrooms of the past? And just thinking about a lot of the younger journalists I know coming into the industry now, I have actually a lot of hope for the future.
That's fantastic to hear. Tara?
I think it has to go back to that mindset thing, and kind of stepping away from believing people like you are better, and understanding that actually women, mothers, you know, it could be a Black woman, it could be a working class woman, actually that could enrich their storytelling. For me, I think I've become a better journalist since I've been a mum. So I think it's about that mindset of actually, what can this person do for you with the kind of, as this woman's getting older, as she's had her children, right? Do you know what I mean? So for me, it's about a mind shift, but I think that will take time.
You've made me think so much about diversity in all different ways, both in terms of your team and who you recruit and work with, but that network as well. So thank you. So just brilliant insights from all of you. And Dominic, what's your view on the one thing we can do?
I am optimistic that things have changed a lot since the pandemic. I just hope that maybe women who are like returning to the workplace maybe after a break are just really ambitious about the sort of jobs they apply for, because I know, speaking personally, I know other people I speak to have got a real appreciation of the sort of skills and talent that people can bring, and And I think there's a good moment now where people are much more appreciative of, you know, people working flexibly. So I'm hopeful that although the pandemic's been really challenging for a lot of people, that there is going to be a real shift that comes out of it in the way people work.
Yeah, being ambitious about the roles we go for and what we ask for, what we need to enable us to be brilliant. I think
so. And can I put my plug in now for the charity?
Please put your plug in.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm here partly as an ambassador for the journalist charity that I know wants to be part of these sort of conversations and to support some of these issues in the industry. So I'm sort of really proud to be here as part of that, and just to remind people, if they don't know, the journalist charity is there for people when they're in need, whoever they are. So if anyone's at a tough point in their career or is in financial difficulties, they're there and they're very willing to give out grants and some other types of support to journalists. So please use that. And also, if anyone wants to support them, journalists need all the support they can get, don't they? So it's free to sign up for it as a supporter to help sort of colleagues wherever they are.
Thanks very much, Dominic. And thank you so much to all of you for being just such an incredible panel and sharing so many fantastic insights. Thank you. Thank you to the team at Women in Journalism, who've been fantastic partners and co-collaborators through this project. Huge thank you to my team at Man Bites Dog, who've all worked so hard on this passion project for all of us. And thank you to Cision, Coleman Parks and Big Helping for supporting with this campaign too. So let's go forth and close the gender news gap and all of these diversity news gaps. And I hope between us we can actually move from this awareness and really take it forward into action with some of the great ideas that you've all had. And let's keep this conversation going. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you very much to everyone who joined. Thank you.